Welcome back to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin. On this episode, I'm joined by Jason Bay, who is the founder and CEO at Outbound Squad. We talk about a whole bunch of things on the sales side. I learned a ton, but we also focus a lot on why the traditional SDR model isn't really a fit for how buyers buy and what might be a better solution. And he also gives some really practical and actionable advice on how to sell during a recession. On to the episode. Hey, Jason, welcome to the show.
I'm excited to be here, man. We've been scheming for a while on this. So
we're prepared. We're good to go now.
yeah.
So, well, since we've been scheming, I'm just going to dive right in, with a question to kick it off that I thought was super interesting that you brought up. And it involves cold calling, which, common topic, constant topic in the sales world. But you said you can land meetings from cold calls without pitching your product. I want to hear more about that. So let's dive into it.
Yeah, I think there's a common misconception. There's a couple things that I run into with cold calling. One, the data, especially from Gong, supports that a rep actually talks about 55% of the time in successful cold calls, and the prospect talks about 45%. Whenever I show that stat, it's always kind of like people are like, oh, wow, wait, we can talk more than the prospect, because you've always been taught in sales that you have 2 ears and one mouth, use them proportionally, talk less. And so I always start with that stat, and people are always like, okay, cool. Well, what do I talk about then? Because when I pitch my product and talk about my stuff at the beginning, the call doesn't tend to last very long when you do that. And I think if you sit in the seat of your prospect, especially an executive, they're just looking for instances and examples of, does this person sound like a peer? Do they work with people like me? Am I going to learn anything from this individual? So the way to nail that first 60 seconds of the cold call really is to demonstrate business acumen and that you know who the person is. So instead of pitching and trying to bring the prospect over into our world, let's get in their world first and add context to what we do by explaining it through the lens of their world. So what I recommend is using a simple permission-based opener that's, hey, Dustin, Jason with Outbound Squad. You mind if I take a minute to share the reason for my call? You can let me know if we want to keep chatting. And if you do that correctly, typically 9 times out of 10, prospect will be like, sure, what's going on? Mm-hmm. So instead of then saying, well, hey, at Outbound Squad, we train companies like Medallia and Gong and help their account executives and their SDRs set more meetings. And by the way, I'd like to talk to you about our training. That's going to get shut down immediately. And the person's going to think, we already trained people in-house. We already do this. So I'm not going to talk about my solution at all. I'm going to talk about what I am hearing from other people like them. And if I have research to add context to that, that's even better. So what I would do is something like, hey, Dustin, I understand you're the VP of sales at so-and-so company. The reason I was reaching out to you, I noticed that you guys aren't doing a lot of hiring right now. And last year, you guys launched some new products. And the reason I was giving you a call is what I'm hearing from VPs of sales that are clients like Gong and Medallia is that they're not doing a lot of hiring right now, and their account executives, they're relying on them to self-source more pipeline. And the second thing is that they really need to get more efficiency and result outcomes from their sales development teams to help pick up the slack. How does that compare to what you're working on right now and what you're thinking about? So if I can be really laser focused on your world, what other people like you are working on, I don't have to pitch my product at all, because you're naturally going to ask me what I do at that point. And then that's a nice segue into asking for the meeting where you're engaged and you're interested versus me trying to get you interested.
Yeah, 100%. I think so. Like, I work on the marketing and sales side here, and kind of the marketing equivalent to me is the whole banner blindness, right? So like, you're on LinkedIn, all the ads look the same. This is kind of the same. Honestly, all cold calls I get, or a lot of cold calls I get, are the same. And it is that I work for company XYZ. We do sales enablement. Do you do sales enablement? And immediately I'm just like, okay, I feel like a jerk for doing it because I manage a sales team, but it's hard to get engaged with those calls and get into it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like you're not sharing anything. Like, that person, whoever made that call, didn't demonstrate anything about what they know about your world. Like, if I was calling on for a sales enablement solution, I'd be like, hey, Dustin, I see that you manage a team of X amount of reps. Did I get that right? Yeah. Well, the reason I was giving you a call is I don't know how you're approaching sales enablement right now, but what we're seeing a trend of is leaders caring a lot more about enablement teams driving sales outcomes like quota attainment, reducing ramp time versus completion of certificates and completion of course modules. how are you guys shifting how you measure enablement and what they're producing heading into 2023? Like I'm sharing something insightful. That's what the whole Challenger sales methodology and book and that big revolution was all about, was commercial teaching. And you can do that in a really simple way in a cold call just by sharing what other people like them are thinking about and trying to add context to their situation based on the research that you did.
Yeah,
So it becomes
100%.
a sharing of an insight and something I'm seeing versus getting you interested in my product.
Exactly. So once you get them engaged, they're listening to the conversation, it's kind of a peer-to-peer conversation. How or when do you then make that transition to, what you do? How do you make that switch over that way?
Yeah, so I don't really switch at all unless they ask, and I'll kind of tell you how I talk about it if they don't ask also, because you'll actually get a lot of that too. If you really nail the person's world and what they're going through, you'll find that there's nothing but curiosity on their end. So the middle part of the call, so we just talked about the first part, I call it making an entrance. The middle part of the call, I call it syncing up. So essentially what we want to do during this part is find some sort of problem or gap or really engage the person to get them interested in an outcome that they're trying to seek. I recommend you do this through a framework called question stacking. So, long story short, question stacking is very similar to the priority drop in that I'm like sharing an insight and then asking a question around it. So, in the VP of sales example I gave earlier, AE self sourcing. So, let's say that you're like, yeah, we're really trying to get our AEs to prospect more. Like, they need to pick up the slack on the pipeline. So I might say something like, interesting. A lot of, what I'm hearing folks do with their AEs is, running like virtual power hours, like getting everyone on the same page, calling together. They're really focusing on enablement and getting better content so that they know how to pick up the phone, how to make calls. They're also focused on aligning the SDRs and the AEs a little tighter. How are you guys approaching that right now?
So on our end, it's interesting. We have one SDR, two AEs. So definitely on the smaller side at the moment. And what we're doing is kind of similar, but more through email, is asking those questions right away. That like having the AE actually ask them of, this is what's going on. We've been seeing this. Is that something that you're seeing? And trying to go that route. But that being said, I mean, honestly, we're getting hit with a few common objections lately that we weren't getting hit with when things were sweet last year, right? So we're running into a few things there.
Yeah. I love how you went into role play mode right there. Um, so that's great. Now we're in the conversation. So I might ask you one more question in that instance. What kind of objections are you hearing? And then what would you share? If I was like, oh, interesting. What objections are you getting right now that you weren't getting a year ago? Because I'm hearing this from a lot of sales leaders too.
Yeah, I would say budget is the main one.
Budget.
People being a little conservative with their spend, a little safe given the, recession, if you want to call it a recession yet.
No, totally. So kind of what I got from you is it sounds like you are double down, focused on the AUs, helping with the messaging and really just making sure they know how to handle objections. Could I make a quick suggestion?
Sure.
Yeah, I know I was calling you out of the blue earlier. Do you mind if we unpack this at a time when I'm not, kind of cold calling you in the middle of your day? I'd love to share how Gong and Medallia and sales leaders at those companies are tackling similar challenges and seeing if there might be a fit for a conversation here. Do you get your calendar handy?
Sure. Yeah.
That's it. And you go in to schedule the
Yeah.
meeting. And you might get resistance there. Usually you don't because you've already done all the stuff at the beginning. I'm not a fan of asking for time at the very beginning of the call
Yeah.
because it will invite objections. And oftentimes they're not very easy objections to handle. It's like, not interested. I don't have time. I'm too busy right now. And it's like, why invite those objections if you don't need to when you can create a reason for meeting? But it's as simple usually as that. Like I work with a lot of software companies that sell a lot of different stuff. And it's like I work with a company that sells a solution that reduces cost to serve. So think of like companies that have a lot of chat support. Like the number one metric for that company and the customers they serve is, are they happy? CSAT score. And are we reducing the amount of resources it requires on our end to support them and keep them happy? If I call on the SVP of contact centers there, he or she is not going to care about how we go about doing that. They're not even going to open the platform or have a user like instance in there. They just want to know what outcomes we can help them with. So usually the what do we do is um like we can make the problem that we were just talking about go away. Let's talk a little bit more about how other companies like yours are tackling that. If I'm talking to someone below the line, let's say, or to someone at a smaller company who will be using the product, I might need to get a little bit more like into the weeds on how we actually do that. But you don't need to as much as you would think, you know? So it's like if I was talking about training, instead of saying we can help you with that, I might say, well, hey, we're doing that through some pretty creative training right now. So it's a mix of training, playbook creation. We work with enablement to make sure that the retention of the information post training is really high. We got course content, and all of those things kind of mixed into one typically will increase the amount of meetings that a team is setting by 20 to 40%. How about we unpack that a little bit more when I'm calling you in the middle of your day? Like I might get a little bit more granular with it if it is someone that is below the line that I would be interacting with a lot, but most of the time I'm just going to focus on big outcomes that we can help with.
Nice. And I like the ask there, almost you're doing the person a favor a little bit of, let's set this at a time when you're
Yeah.
not so busy and I'm not interrupting you. Cause I get my guard up, honestly, when I get a few years ago, it was the don't ask for 30 minutes, ask for 29, all those kind of gimmicky things
Yeah.
that maybe worked when things were good. But I hear a number like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, doesn't matter what, just the guard goes up and I can't help it. And like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of potential buyers are feeling that right now.
Yeah. It feels very high friction, and when
Yeah.
you're cold calling, you're doing an activity that has a lot of friction associated with it. It's not an easy activity for the prospect or for the rep. So if I can reduce friction as much as possible, that's great. So it's make an entrance. That's the first 60 seconds and sync up in the middle and then say goodbye. You want to be the person to say goodbye and kind of naturally transition the conversation into asking for a meeting and give a purpose to that meeting. And ideally, that purpose is to talk about outcomes and problems, not about features and functions.
For sure. And talking about natural transitions, I'm actually going to try to take this in a direction you were talking about there with AE self-sourcing, right? Because
Yeah.
when things are good, the AE is getting tons of meetings booked, their
Yep.
calendar is full. It's not like that right now for a lot of companies, right? There's more free time, less meetings, it's harder to get a meeting. And you talked about some of the tactics to get AEs involved
Mm.
and kind of enable them to do that. What are your thoughts more on like culturally just snapping AEs out of that who are maybe used to sitting back and waiting for those meetings and not used to the hunting side because it's been a while?
Yeah. I think just show them the data, show them the numbers. So, um, God, this is such a tough one because if you have I've seen teams with an entire culture, sales culture of hundreds of reps that don't self source.
Mhm.
And to your point earlier, when the economy is really good, you can hit quota without self sourcing pipeline. But I think what's really important to the rep is to explain how their quota was calculated because it was calculated with self sourcing in mind. No company calculates a rep's quota with the intention of supplying 100% of their pipeline through inbound and SDRs. That just doesn't happen in my experience. So I think starting with the data and how the company calculated the quota. And then I think also Sales Loft has got some interesting data, Bridge Group, and their data kind of conflicts a bit, but they both show that a quarter to a half plus of pipeline, depending on your sales motion and who you sell to and your average deal size, needs to be self-sourced. So I think showing people the math is super important. It's like if you just continue on the trajectory that you were on these last 12 months, here's what the next 12 months are going to look like. But the more important part is giving them actual enablement around it. There's this expectation with prospecting. I don't know why it's like this because no other part of the sales motion is like this, where it's just like, just do it, Dustin. Go and make calls and emails with no enablement around like, hey, here's some messaging that you can at least use as a starting point. Here's a talk track or a structure. Like, of course, people aren't going to do it. The rejection rate is extremely high if you're not skilled at this activity. So of course someone's not going to do it, and they're going to feel like it's a waste of their time if they're not enabled properly. So I think that we're going to see a big trend not only in AE self-sourcing, but the enablement of that. And I really challenge sales leaders too. If you think it's so easy, why don't you do it? You know what I mean? Like, why don't you
Yeah.
go make it happen for these reps and show them how to do it? Because you're not demonstrating success either. I interact with not just sales executive, but oftentimes managers that don't even really know how to cold call. They never really had to do it when they were a manager. That's bad. You can't be a frontline manager and not know how to do the activity. It's like a personal trainer that doesn't know how to do the exercises. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So I think just more focus and enablement around this. It doesn't have to be the channel, but it's going to represent a third to a half plus of your pipeline in 2023. You're going to need to master this skill.
for sure. And I think, I mean, you kind of hinted at there. We went through years where it was just hit these activity metrics and it'll work. And like just hammer home, 100
Yep.
calls a day, this many emails, and you just can't do that many good interactions in a day. It's not feasible, right? And playing that numbers game doesn't really
Yeah.
pan out. And it just honestly it burns your TAM a little bit if you're just constantly annoying them with the same message over and over and over again, right?
Yeah, dude, there's so much there. Like that's a whole conversation that we could have because
Yeah.
if you really look at the data, um, Howard Dover, I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff. He's a professor at UT Dallas and their sales program there. He heads up the sales program. And there's actually a lot of interesting research done on sales that you just never hear about it because it's done at the university level.
Yeah.
But they were looking at a trend over the last 5 years. I'm going to kind of botch these numbers, but it was essentially that SDRs outnumber account executives in terms of the amount of hiring that they've done in the last 5 years. And this is nothing against SDRs. It's just like when the front spear, like the tip of the spear of your company is someone that has basically zero business acumen, doesn't know the prospects, and is being enabled through automation that actually doesn't increase their effectiveness. It just increases overall volume. We have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of SDRs sending out spam basically to prospects. And people adjust to that. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
your market will adjust and it's everyone that is reaching out to your market is desensitizing these people to this type of outreach. I mean, look how bad it is with like people that engage with IT leaders and CISOs right now. It's so bad. These people just do not respond to
Mhm.
cold emails and they don't pick up the phone. And Connect and Sell's got a bunch of interesting data too, but essentially the pickup rates just go down every single year.
Yeah.
Pretty soon, I mean, like cold calling is a game of right now, like you have to be a freaking like ninja at cold calling to make it work for you because so few people pick up. You know what I mean? So I really worry about where we're heading with that. The future of outbound, I feel like, is very uncertain here in these next like 3 to 5 years. Like it wouldn't surprise me if Gmail and Outlook just banned and SalesLoft's ability to even connect with their email servers to send emails. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of where I think that we're going with all of this stuff. So what do you do now? I think right now you better like be building business acumen and know what your prospects care about so that you can stand out. You can be the 1%, which it's just not hard to do that. You can be the 1% of reps on a call or an email. Like you can really stand out.
Yeah, and that's a good point about, you know, Gmail potentially and other providers. I mean, we're even seeing that with LinkedIn with their split inbox now, right? Where they
Yeah.
have this primary inbox and then this they don't call it spam, but it's kind of what they're saying with it, right? By separating it out.
Yep.
And same thing with my phone. I get calls from big, well-known companies trying to pitch a product that I know, but it says suspected spam on the phone, right?
Yeah.
So I don't pick it up, and then I check the voicemail. I'm like, oh, it's a $500 million company. It's still suspected spam. So we're just getting
Yeah.
better and better at that. So you talked about Bridge Group, Sales Loft, all these companies that are collecting sales data and putting it out to the public. I know you have some predictions based on that data in 2023. So let's go through a couple of those real quick for someone.
Yeah. I think the big one was we talked about AE self sourcing is a really big one.
Yeah.
I think another trend to be aware of is the ratio of SDRs to AEs. So if I kind of pull that up here. So the data traditionally, especially Bridge Group's data, it's stuck pretty tight over the last 3 or 4 years to like one SDR for every 2 to 2.5 AEs. And I believe I'm already starting to see a trend of it in 2023 that we're going to see that ratio increase for the first time in 3 or 4 years, as in SDRs will have to support more account executives. I'm seeing a big trend of companies that are still hiring account executives, but not hiring SDRs. Most of the companies I work with are not at a 1-to-2 ratio. It's like 1-to-4.
Mhm.
And I think what people are realizing is that the cost justification for SDRs has traditionally been take an account executive who has an OTE of 100K or 200K, excuse me, and a BDR with an OTE of 80K, 70 or 80K or whatever, right? Just throwing out some numbers. Those are very kind of similar to what I might see in the field. The cost justification is that I can get 2 SDRs for 1 AE.
Yeah.
But when you actually look, that's true. Like you can get 2 people for the cost of 1. But when you look at the actual overall increase in output, like the cost actually increases because the output is not hired for that account executive. They aren't closing twice the amount of work.
Mhm.
So if you're going to spend twice the amount, like if you're better off hiring another account executive is my point for most companies.
Yeah.
Like the SDR motion, like I think Pavilion ran a study last year. It's like, dude, over 80% of the sales development teams that they surveyed didn't hit quota in 2021. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So we have these like huge teams, VC backed, where it's just higher, 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 and what they're producing is not profitable for the company. And I think that like once funding is starting to get cut off or at least frozen for a lot of these companies, and I think when they look at the math, they're going to realize that our SDR function actually doesn't work. And it's not, by the way, because I don't think it doesn't like that as a function doesn't work. I think most companies don't know how to make it work.
Yeah, the
So
SDR, it's always interesting too because it's very much a hire someone fresh out of college, throw them to the wolves and put them out there because it's a hard job. Like I've always said, it's one of
oh God,
I
yeah.
would not want to go back and do it. It's one
Can
of the
you
most
imagine
difficult
at like
jobs.
23 years old doing an SDR's job? I'm like, I would be frightened to talk to some of the people that they have these like, I'm not much older. I'm 33, but like these are kids. You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I when I started, I was doing the door to door, old school, knocking on a
That's what I
door,
did.
getting rejected,
Yeah.
getting it slammed in your face.
Yeah.
But at least that was low volume, and you get to see faces. This is just, yeah, I agree. It's not really a sustainable, tough model, and we're not really enabling them. So, do you see the future then being more, full cycle AEs essentially, and them taking on more of the sourcing, replacing the SDR role?
I think that would be part of it. I, in the last couple years, have worked more and more with enterprise and strategic selling teams,
Hmm.
and I realized why they despise SDRs so much. It, and it's not the fault of the SDR. I think it's a compensation thing from the company.
Yeah.
It's like I was working with a company that sells conversational intelligence, and they want to get in touch with like CROs and SVPs of sales at the Fortune 1000.
Hmm.
Do you think any of those people want to talk to someone that's 23 years old that has zero business acumen? They just don't. They don't want to talk to those people. You know what I mean? And the compensation is around booking meetings. That's another debate. I think we're going to see more of a trend towards people actually measuring the success of the SDR function, not on quality meetings booked, but on sales accepted opportunities, sales qualified leads, like stuff progressing through the sales funnel, even though they don't have 100% control over that. It's the trend that we're seeing with marketing being measured more on revenue. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Um, so in terms of where I see that going, I do think because I do work with a couple clients that they have hundreds of full cycle sales reps, no SDRs. I do think that we will see a trend towards that.
Hmm.
I do think that people will rethink the SDR role and how they align with the account executive. Because at least I can comment on the enterprise and strat level. What you're better off having that person do is your ground swelling for you. So if I'm trying to break into a Fortune 1000 account, the SDR all day can talk to like in the conversational intelligence example, they can call reps and ask about the sales methodology that they use. They can call sales managers and ask about problems that they're having getting reps to do whatever. They can talk to enablement managers about how they enable stuff and the problems they're running into. And they can really just like help shape the hypothesis and the narrative that seasoned account executive, the person with over a decade of industry experience that you want speaking with the executive, they can really help that person do a lot of the busy work that they would need to do to really understand what's going on inside that account. I think that's where we're going to see it shift.
Hmm.
And I think that the other stuff too is like the account executive should be prospecting also. It should be to like economic and like executive type buyers, and they shouldn't have to go hunt down email addresses and phone numbers and all that other kind of stuff. I think you're going to see more of it like an account development rep style like that. I really wonder whether this even works on the smaller deal sizes. When I say smaller, stuff like under $50,000, I wonder how well it actually will work for most companies because the volume isn't there to support it. It's not like these SDRs are booking 30 meetings a month. You know what I mean? You have a few outliers here and there doing that. But that's where I think where we're going to see a shift.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially on the, focusing on sales qualified opportunities. The thing that's
Mm,
kind of blows my mind is, I've worked in the past with some like outsourced SDR providers, right? And
yeah.
back then, senior people on my team, myself, we were pushing for, yeah, we don't want to comp you on meetings specifically. We want revenue, we want qualified opportunities, but they don't do that for their internal team, which just
Yeah.
never really made sense, right? But when we did make that push and we aligned to revenue, we saw a substantial difference, not even just from a cost perspective, but just quality meetings, people actually showing up, people actually having
Yeah.
engaging conversations.
Oh, yeah, big time. We have a program where individuals can pay out of pocket for coaching.
Mhm.
And I was helping this woman. She's an SDR, and she was like, want to know how to tackle these like 100 accounts that all the five AEs she's assigned has.
Mhm.
I found it really difficult to help her because the way she was wanting to approach it, it was in alignment with her compensation plan, but it didn't really align with how you would tackle it if you were an account executive. Like if you and I were going through a list of companies, we're thinking which one of these has the most likelihood to close. We aren't
Yeah,
thinking which one
100%.
has the most likelihood to get a meeting. You don't think like that. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
so it's like again, I think it's a compensation thing, and you'll see like an extreme of this where people are so against SDRs being compensated on stuff that happens after the first meeting. It's like everyone should share in that. Maybe it's a third of their compensation, and they still get a little gimme, for a qualified meeting set. But it's like, how are we rewarding people based on like, I don't want you to set up that meeting with that manager that is not in the department that we would normally sell to, that I might be able to get some intel to, that I'm then going to have to do way more work to multi-thread. Like, it just doesn't make sense, you know? So I think it's a compensation problem, really.
Yeah, it's funny seeing the parallels. Like been, I started out in sales, mostly in marketing. Now I'm doing both. It's funny seeing the parallels to marketing, right? We just went through this with the MQL thing where,
Hmm.
oh, marketing hit their MQL number and then you hit 40% of revenue. It's like just that
Yeah.
misalignment is really tough. I actually really like that, maybe it is the whole recession thing, but we're getting back to that efficiency and being smart with your spend and time and, making
Yep.
sure it's not just top line revenue. Um, so we talked about this, where we were scheming a little bit before. Selling in a recession is new for a lot of people. And I think a lot of the things
Hmm.
we already talked about are going to be key to it. Do you have any other tips for people who just haven't experienced this new environment we're in?
Uh, there's a couple things, and then I'll let you know kind of the skill that you're going to need to get really good at from a selling
Yeah.
standpoint. So when I sold during the last recession, it was not B2B in this industry. I was selling house painting services in construction,
Okay.
so very different thing that I was selling. So that context is important, but a lot of the principles are similar in that the noise that you hear from your market oftentimes doesn't represent how actually people feel and internally at that company and how they're making decisions. So, like with a recession, where people are feeling pressure is to cut unnecessary spending, right? That's a really big thing. How can we cut unnecessary spending, kind of extend our runway, do all of that kind of
Hmm.
stuff? So, cutting unnecessary spending is really a positioning exercise.
Yep.
Like take Testimonial Hero. Like you could just like, oh, yeah, it'll help you gather testimonials. You know what I mean? Like, I want to talk to you. It's like, that's not really what it helps with, though. You know what I mean? Like, I would make an argument that if any company has any kind of initiatives around generating leads, getting increasing conversions on any kind of performance marketing that they're doing,
Hmm.
retaining employees, you could even maybe even or and retaining customers, you could even make an argument of that too. It's like those are the things that I want to attach my product to if I'm selling your product. Same with sales training. I could focus on, oh, we create playbooks and all this other stuff, and I'm just going to talk to enablement people the entire time. Enablement's not even tied to revenue.
Mhm.
I need to talk about stuff that is impacting the entire revenue organization. So it's a positioning thing and talking about the right stuff. So what does that mean? That means you need to get really good at multi-threading. And one of the key ingredients is like you need to really define uh like what the cost of inaction is. It's what they call it in Challenger. Or if you
Mhm.
do use Medic, it's the implicate the pain. It's this thing, right? I'll give it my client example that helps support centers and stuff like that reduce their cost to serve. I was just doing an exercise with them earlier today, and it's like they're stuck below the line with a prospect at a big org that just like won't like invite them into conversations with their VPs and like economic buyers.
Mhm.
And what we're looking at is like they've quantified a problem that they believe to be $2.5 million of waste in their contact center on a monthly basis, which is huge.
Yeah.
And it's like they worked with the team at that company, the below the line people in the contact center to find those numbers. Like they are validated on that level. It's like that invites a conversation with that SVP of the contact centers or the people that oversee uh like the entire business unit that supports the customer support function. And knowing how to navigate those conversations and get to that level is going to be really big. So I think one, you need to be able to connect whatever you're doing to high level business priorities and you need to figure out what the cost of inaction is. And it might not be big. So they might not care and you can disqualify the deal and move on to something else. You need to get really good at multi-threading and speaking to other people and setting the stage at the very beginning that I'm not just going to talk to you about this. Like, if you care about fixing this problem, we have to get other people involved with this, and they're going to be able to add a perspective to this that's going to help you internally. Um, and then I think the other thing too is it's this concept that prospecting doesn't stop after the first meeting. So I need to be way more diligent in my prep. If I hop on a meeting with Dustin, I need to know at that meeting who else, if this goes well, needs to be involved in this sales cycle. I need to know that going
Mhm.
in. And I need to ask for it and I need to do it regardless of if I get permission or not. It's more coaching around if this prospect feels like you can help them, it's coaching them on how to get a deal done and less about asking for permission or asking them to intro to the boss or any of that kind of stuff. Like you need to get really good at having those conversations. That I think is the big thing in 2023 from a sales standpoint is this has to happen like the first interactions that you have with a new people at a new account. This has to start happening.
Yeah, I think that ties almost full circle to what you're saying with, speaking for myself too, 23, fresh out of school, starting sales. There's no way in hell I could have that conversation.
Yeah.
I didn't know enough, right? So it does tie into that. The other thing I like there as well is just, you know, actually getting on the side of them and working with them to close the sale up,
Yep.
which is also a skill. That's hard. It's
Yep.
even hard from a I don't, like just putting yourself out there to do that, right? There's a bit of that imposter syndrome, I think, especially for junior reps who, are
Yeah.
afraid to make that ask, afraid to do that, afraid to maybe be presumptive.
Mhm.
But totally agree. I mean, we've seen deals, great call. You think everything's wonderful, but you didn't set the follow up. You didn't figure out who else needed to be involved, and the deal ghosts when you know for sure it was a legit opportunity. And I think we're
Yeah.
just going to see more and more of that.
Yeah, it's I think you have to have a lot of empathy for the person that you're talking to and try to put yourself in their shoes. I speak to a lot of people that are fairly new in position. So think about the internal risk there is for them politically to make a
Yeah.
bad decision and bringing someone in that they're not quite it's a lot of pressure. And a really good way to take that pressure off your buyer is to encourage and to demand really that they get other people involved so it's not just all coming down to them. Like don't make them do all the internal selling,
Hmm.
you know? Um just one last comment too, because you said junior rep taking the risk. It's like, dude, you want to get the nose early in the sales cycle so that you can avoid getting them at the end. So I'd
That,
rather know early that, oh, Dustin, he's not really going to want to like loop in other people on his team. So I need to be thinking now instead of just giving Dustin the proposal and saying, go take it to your boss or whatever. Like I need to be thinking in advance who else might need to get involved because this person like is not really a champion.
yeah,
Like a
100%.
champion
Yeah.
is someone that is willing to help you because they see value and they're able to help you because they have influence, you know? And I think we got
Yeah.
to get really, really good at what in medic, they talk a lot about the difference between a coach and a champion. There's a big difference between those two. In Challenger, it was the talker versus the mobilizer, right? Like, who are the mobilizer? Like, we got to get really good at identifying who those people are.
Yeah, I like the fact about DQing deals a little
Mhm.
quicker now too, right?
Yeah.
Like, it sucks as a salesperson to get a no, especially when you're new, but it shouldn't, right? Like if there's just legitimately this isn't a good fit, it's not a good opportunity. Don't let
Yeah.
it drag out. Figure it out. DQ it. Move on to the next, right? But I think
Yep.
that takes a while because the no's sting. You like no is this bad thing that's trying to attack you, and you're trying to avoid it. But I think that's good
Yeah.
advice because you're just going to get more no's in this environment, and that's okay. Focus on the other ones.
Yeah. Get them early. The
Yeah,
part that will be a little tough too as a junior rep is odds are that you don't have a good manager. That's just kind of how it works. And that's a whole nother big problem
yeah.
where managers get zero enablement and training.
Mhm.
I've never seen a training program internally for managers at any company I've ever worked with. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I think it's their responsibility, but it's not their fault kind of thing.
Mhm.
But what you have to deal with a lot as a rookie rep is, you might get shit for disqualifying that deal.
Exactly.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah.
like think about where are you consuming sales advice? And it could be on podcasts like this, could be on LinkedIn, but hopefully you have other people in the game in your maybe not necessarily in your industry that you're not competing against, but like other reps that you can talk to about this stuff. I think that's super important. You should have 3 to 5 other peers and you could meet them through LinkedIn. That's how easy it is these days.
Mhm.
You should be friends with 3 to 5 other like SaaS sellers that work at similar types of companies that can tell you that like can show you the ropes when it comes to this stuff and tell you what's ridiculous and what isn't because you could be so full in a just being in a box at a company where you're only getting information from your manager who's not that good at their job who was an okay seller. Like that
Yeah.
just will ruin your experience.
Yeah. 100%. I think that's a whole other topic we won't dive into, but where to
Yeah.
get your advice from and like
Yeah.
who to actually listen to, and is it someone who sells or someone who sold 20 years ago and hasn't since? So there's a whole nother
Yeah.
can of worms there we won't go into. I feel like there's lots of topics we can go into, but you hit a bunch of great ones there to actually help people out going into this new year. I know a lot of sellers are probably feeling the heat, right? Especially in SaaS
Mhm.
and the layoffs, and it's a scary time. So thanks for giving those tips and your predictions. I know you're dropping a whole lot more on LinkedIn and other places, but if our listeners do want to find out more, connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, a couple ways. We pump out a lot of free stuff. So LinkedIn, just look for Jason Bay. Outboundsquad.com is kind of the hub for everything. We got lots of free guides. We're doing typically a webinar or two per month um, on all kinds of different topics, but it's primarily focused on outbound and kind of mid sales funnel, type stuff, discovery, that kind of thing. And then we also work with reps and companies. So outboundsquad.com if you're looking for either free stuff or coaching as a rep or for some of the stuff that we talked about today for us to help you with your team with, we can do that too. So outboundsquad.com is the best place to go.
Nice. Cool. So I'll include those in the show notes for our listeners. But Jason, thanks for joining me, man. There's a lot of good actionable tips people can use there. So definitely appreciate that.
Cool. Yep. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me on this episode of B2B Revenue Leaders. So my key takeaway here is really on, the traditional SDR model just not being profitable or working for most companies. Jason mentioned, 80% of SDR teams didn't hit their quota. Everyone knows it's the whole churn and burn, hire two, maybe one works out model, pick junior people to save money. And just the parallels between that and the old MQL model in marketing, right? Just now that we're going through, who knows what 2023 is going to be, but efficiency is going to be key either way. And I'm looking forward to seeing how those two things change. And Jason gave some great tips here on how to actually make change there and move away from the SDR model. That's my key takeaway. Maybe a bit long-winded there, but this one really hit home. Thanks again for listening to this episode. Head on over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast to subscribe. And we would really appreciate a 5-star review on Apple so more people will give this a listen. All right, on to the next one.